ICFRC hosts community programs to address topics of international interest. We thank our members, volunteers, and interns for making these forums possible since the year Stevie Nicks played at Carver Hawkeye Arena in 1983. So first, let me acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs, the University of Iowa Honors Program, the University of Iowa Center for Public Policy, and the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization. We thank them very much for their financial support. Also, I want to thank today's special sponsors, Bill and Pat Supel and Mike Carberry. I also thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for Cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2, as well as the University of Iowa Library's digital archives. So it's my pleasure to be able to introduce my colleague, Elise Pizzi. She's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Iowa. She came to us in 2015 after earning her Ph.D. in political science from the University of Colorado. Before attending graduate school, Elise taught English in Sichuan, China, and spent 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Republic of Georgia from 2005 to 2007. She received a Fulbright grant to study drinking water access in rural China in 2013. Her expertise is in the politics of how governments in less developed regions and countries provide public goods and services and manage natural resources. Her ongoing research focuses on ethnic politics and poverty alleviation in rural China. Today, she will discuss the identity and political status of China's ethnic minority groups and minority autonomous regions. Please join me in welcoming Elise Pizzi.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. I think it was my first week here in Iowa City that I came to my first talk here. So I've known about this since I've been in Iowa City, and I was warned or promised that I would end up having to give or getting to give a talk here to this group. So so I just want to thank you all for having me here and for letting me talk about some kind of ongoing research that is happening. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about ethnic politics in China, and then I'm going to talk about some research that I'm presenting really for the first time next week at a conference. But so you'll get a little bit of a preview of that before the other political scientists do. So let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, so to start off with, I want to introduce a little bit of a puzzle about collective action and political action in China. So this picture that you can see here is a mass incident that you might have read about in the New York Times or the Washington Post. So this is a village where there was a problem with the local leader taking land from the villagers and selling it without actually giving them any kind of compensation. So this is an illegal activity and was very upsetting for the local villagers. And so what's their recourse? This is what they decided to do, is stand up and protest about their local leader. This is not anti-state, it's not anti-government, it's not against the rules. It's just saying this is a poorly implemented policy in this case, and we want a new leader. And so the response was they got to elect a new leader. This was something that was not crushed, not pushed, not repressed in any way. So this is a big contrast to what we would have seen in Tiananmen Square and what we are seeing right now in ethnic minority areas. So mass incidents like this one are relatively frequent. There are about 200 every day in China. So, this is a large number, more than you would actually expect, right? But they're all very small. These are small events, they're local events, and they're very carefully monitored and limited so that they don't actually get out of hand. So they have to be relatively limited in scope and limited in content. Okay. So in contrast to that, we see, I was hoping everybody had finished their lunch before this picture comes up. So this kind of mass incidents in ethnic minority areas, this is a picture of a Tibetan man. I'm not actually sure if he's in Tibet or in India in this particular picture, protesting by lighting himself on fire. So since 2008, we've seen more than 140 people taking this particular action, lighting themselves on fire in protest of either policies or of Chinese rule in Tibet. So we've seen this mass protest or mass incidents that have gotten a little bit out of hand for the Chinese government. In 2008 and 2009 in Xinjiang also, and then even more recently than that, there's been a series in 2013, 2014. Every now and then these kinds of things kind of crop up. Now, the narrative that you'll hear from the Chinese government is not about righteous protest, is not about local government, but about terrorism and about separatism. So these incidents are interpreted as separatist incidents, as splitism is what they call it, and these are seen as obviously anti-state, right, and as an existential threat to the Chinese government, to the Chinese Communist Party, right? So interpreted very, very differently. The result, of course, is that these then are met with heavy repression. So the protests in 2008 and 2009 led to many detentions, thousands of detentions, so arrests, detentions, and then in some cases even executions for participating in this type of activity. So the puzzle here is how does ethnic identity affect the government response to these kinds of actions, and then also affect how different individuals are going to choose to express their grievances. So in all of these cases, people have grievances, whether you decide they're legitimate or not. How are they going to share this information with the government? So that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we get to that, I want to get a little bit of background here about who are we even talking about when I talk about ethnic minorities, right? So ethnicity is a word that we hear a lot, but in political science, we have to be really very careful about defining who are these different ethnic groups. And I know you've probably heard of Tibetans. I'm sure you've heard of Uyghurs also, but there are a whole lot of minority groups in China that you probably have never heard of. So just to give you a little bit of background here on these different ethnic minority groups. So going back to the founding of China here. So 1949, the background is a conflict between the Nationalist Party, right, the KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party. So the Nationalist Party during the Civil War was not really that concerned about ethnic minorities and making sure that the state was particularly inclusive. So they went back and forth for a little while and then eventually ended up coming up with a policy that the country was going to be a republic of 5 peoples. And the 5 peoples that we're talking about here are Han, which is, of course, the majority, the vast majority, more than 90% if you got your trivia question right. So more than 90% Han. The other groups are Tibetan, which we've just talked about, Mongolian, Manchu, and Hui. So the Uyghurs that you've probably read about in the New York Times and that we'll talk more about today aren't even one of these 5 ethnic groups that are going to be represented. And then if you look at this map, that southwest corner there's a whole bunch of ethnic groups that are also not represented at all. These 5 groups here are largely in the north. So they're Tibetan, which is that yellow. Mongolian is the orange, and then Manchu, the like dark red over there on the far right. Han is kind of in the center and east. And then Hui is a little light green kind of in the center. Hui is actually like relatively spread out throughout China, relatively dispersed. So these are very much north-focused and east-focused and kind of leaves out a lot of the West. So the Chinese Communist Party is trying to contrast themselves, trying to get the buy-in from a lot of different ethnic groups in in the rest of China, even in the southwest. So Mao, of course, on his long march, has to go through some of the southwest, through a lot of these minority areas, and get support from the local people in order to keep the movement even going. Before we even get to a Chinese Communist Party victory, it just has to survive. And so part of that rhetoric, part of the sales pitch for the Chinese Communist Party is that we're going to recognize all ethnic groups, we're all going to be equal, and everyone's going to get representation, right? So China is officially a multi-ethnic nation. Everyone's going to get representation in the People's Congress. But there's a challenge here. I like to think that Mao and the rest of the communist leaders got to Beijing and said, okay, so now we're the rulers of all of these people. Who are they? So this census is really important. We're having debates in this country right now about what kinds of questions should go on the census. The first thing that the new government needs to do is take a census of its people and figure out who are these different people? Who is going to get representation in the Congress? This is your first step. So they do a census. It's 1953. And one of the very few questions that's on this census form is, what is your ethnicity? They don't really even have these categories that they could give you a multiple choice option, though. They just don't even know who the possible categories would be. So they leave it blank and they say, you just write down whatever your ethnic group is. And the result is more than 400 different ethnic groups. Right, so 400 different ethnic groups, 20 of them had one member. So it's clear that there's a little bit of a problem here. This is going to be an administrative nightmare. So if you're going to have these 400 different ethnic groups represented in the People's Congress, that means about 8% of the population is going to have 40% of the representation in the Congress, right? So dramatically over-representing these minority groups in the actual Congress itself. So they decide that what needs to happen is we need to find a system, figure out a way to kind of collapse the number of ethnic groups so that it's more administratively easier to deal with, right? So they give a group of social scientists, some sociologists and anthropologists, they send out teams to each of the different provinces to try to come up with a scientific categorization of who these different people are. And they start off using language as one of the key divisions among different ethnic groups. So the idea is coming partly from Stalin's criteria that one of these national groups, an ethnic group, would have their own language. Then they would also have their own territory, mode of economic production, and then their own psychology or their own culture. But as you probably know, it's really hard to divide. It's hard to divide languages, it's hard to divide cultures, and make it scientific in any way, shape, or form. So this second map that I've put up here, this is different language groups in China. Now you'll notice in contrast to the previous one, now in the southeast corner, there's this like green, that's Cantonese. That's Han people speaking a language that is mutually unintelligible from Mandarin. So we have these language divisions even within what is now one ethnic or considered one ethnic group. And then in addition, we have, even within that kind of like yellowish color, that's all Mandarin officially. But there are local dialects in every single province, and really in every town, you actually have a slightly different accent. So my research is mostly in Guizhou province, which is I'll show you. It's this area right here. So my research is in Guizhou, and over spring break, I was doing some research in Guizhou with some local villagers, and I had with me, there was another professor who's from Guizhou, a graduate student who's from Guizhou, and then we had another graduate student who is from the far north from Jilin, from up here. So she's a graduate student who's from, it's that same like Mandarin speaking area, right? But she's coming down to the very south to do this research. And so we're going through, having these interviews, and at the end of each of the interviews, she and I look at each other and we go, I have no idea what anybody just said. Because they're speaking Guizhou dialect, and even though it's officially the same, a part of the same language, you can't understand. So I'm telling you this partly because I want you to understand that some of the language distinctions, it makes it really hard to get a good, clear distinction between these ethnic groups. What's the difference between dialect and a different language? That you could debate that over and over, right? So these social scientists who are supposed to be dividing up and identifying all of these different ethnic groups, they do the best they can. Right, and they end up coming up with 56 different groups. And then, of course, they have to convince people which ethnic group you're actually a part of. So that was also part of their process. And it's more difficult in some cases than in others. One of the other things that I really want to point out about this, though, is, I guess I should go back to this other map. It's easier to see here. So you see the Zhuang is in this bottom dark orange, and there's a nice little line dividing that province and the province above. The reason there's this nice little dividing line is because they happen to be two different provinces. So they had two different sets of social scientists coming up with classifications, and they decided that people from the same families were in two different ethnic groups. So So I've been at people's houses in Guizhou, and they said to me, oh yeah, right over that hill, the next village over, my cousin lives there, but I'm Bui and he's Zhuang, just because of the way that the classification process worked. But at this point, these classifications, these 56 different groups are largely taken for granted. Yeah, okay. So we have now 56 different ethnic groups, but there's a lot of diversity within them. And part of the reason that I'm emphasizing this is because when we talk about Uyghur activities or talk about Tibetan activities, it might not spread to everybody within that classification. There's a lot of variation. There are going to be different sects, different groups, different families that may or may not feel the same way and feel this same identity. So again, in Guizhou province, this is one of the Miao group that is also known as Hmong. And in the US, there's I think a large Hmong population, I think in the Twin Cities, maybe. That's just one branch, of course. So this group is very, very different from the folks the next village over, and then across the province, they actually speak quite a different language. It's hard for them to they can understand, but it's very hard for them to understand. So we have actually, even though more than 90% of the population is Han, we have a huge diversity within China. Okay. So, what issues are ethnic then? So I've given you these definitions of what are these different ethnic groups, what constitute ethnic politics. So I've come up with a list of some of the issues that sometimes fall in ethnic politics. So cultural and religious practices, of course, if they're associated with your particular ethnic group, language policies, what language you can use in school, what language you can use in a textbook, those kinds of things. Environmental policies, depending on where they are in the country, depending on who's implementing and how they're implementing them, resource policies, migration. So I like that one of the questions here also asks about, on your trivia sheet also asks about migration. Migration is a huge issue in China and is now also part of ethnic politics because of where the migration is going and which different groups are actually interacting. Inequality and economic opportunity, of course, anything that has to do with either affirmative action or discrimination or opportunity for members of an ethnic group to make their lives better, autonomy, and then, of course, governance quality. So these are all like a whole host of different issues, and I'm sure there are more that I didn't think of that could fall under the rubric of ethnic politics. And I'm happy to talk about any or all of these in the Q&A section. But what I want to focus on here is governance and governance response. So I mentioned before these different types of protests and different responses. The way that governance works in China is basically that the center, this is a simplified version, the center decides what the priorities are, and then policy is implemented further down the chain. So the center decides what the policy is. For example, we're going to have economic growth. And then further down the chain, the provinces say how much economic growth we're going to have, and then the counties implement it, and then townships implement activities that will then lead to that economic growth. So sometimes you get things that happen like these, like I mentioned with the ethnic classifications, right, where different provinces implement a policy slightly differently, and that's part of the reason. Yeah. Okay, so part of the problem with this kind of decentralized implementation of a policy, and with not having things like elections, is that sometimes it's hard to know if the local governments are actually implementing the policy as they said they would. Right? So officials from higher up are supposed to know whether or not the officials lower down are actually building roads, building schools, stealing land from the villagers, those kinds of things. Now, in the protest that I talked about earlier, on this picture on the upper right, part of the problem that they're protesting against is just the implementation of policy, right? So the policy is not to steal land from the villagers, but that was how it's implemented. So that's a problem. The central government is going to allow that kind of activity to take place because then they get information about how the policy was implemented. Without some kind of response from the people, without that kind of protest, they might never know that the local government is actually incredibly corrupt and is actually cheating the people. And this is going to be a problem for the CCP, the government overall, that makes them look illegitimate if they can't actually implement policy as it's meant to be. So in this particular case, the government gets information. In the Tiananmen Square case on the bottom here, that is a different case. So instead of being about policy implementation, that's about changing the whole system. So then that becomes an existential threat, right? So one is providing information about implementation, and the other is actually threatening to the state. So you can see that one would be encouraged or at least allowed, and the other very much repressed. So this information piece, one of the reasons that we think that they allow protest is because it allows for very reliable information about the strength of grievances, right? You don't go out and protest just on your lunch hour just because you feel like it. You might send an email to your senator just on your lunch hour because you feel like it. But you won't go out and protest. So you're going to see a little bit of the strength of an actual grievance. But you also are incurring some costs here. So this is something about the quality of information that you're going to get from a protest is slightly different from what you get from just an email or something like that. Now, it's really important to emphasize again, just for those protests to go forward, they have to be really local issues that aren't going to spread, that aren't going to be about more than the government can handle and can change all at once. And they have to have some kind of pro-state rhetoric. So we need to make sure that these protests are still pro-CCP, pro-government, and very local, because then we can actually respond appropriately. So this kind of fits into our overall, there we go, overall sort of menu of political activities that you could take. So I mentioned you could send an email to your senator. In the U.S., you could also vote. You could write a letter. You could, contribute to a campaign, or you could go out and protest. So in China, you also have a range of options that you could take if you have some kind of problem with the government. But there's different costs and different rewards associated with each of them. So this picture I also took a couple weeks ago. There's a poster on that pole of somebody was just documenting some local corruption. And he wanted people to know about it and wanted to make it public. And so he just came up, we were eating lunch, and he just taped up this notice. So everybody on the street takes a little break from their lunch, goes out, reads it, goes back to their business. So this is something that is publicly informing of this problem, but not really, not that high of a risk. It doesn't involve throwing stones, and it doesn't involve masses of people either. So when we think about these choices about different types of political actions, we think about whether or not they're public or private. So who is the actual audience? Is it everyone, other citizens, or is it just government officials? And then what are the costs and potential benefits, and the risks and rewards? So basically, we think that people are largely rational, right? That they're going to take some calculation of what the risks and rewards are and try to get a favorable response from the government. But these are also, these possible favorable responses are very much shaped by the state. The state can change the incentive structure in such a way that I want you to go out and vote. I saw Putin had, 70% turnout? Yeah, really high turnout for an election that we already knew what the conclusion was going to be, right? But so he's incentivized people to get out and vote anyway, right? So the state can change the incentives in such a way that they get different responses from the people. Now, when it comes to political action by ethnic minorities, that's where we're going to see some differences in these incentives. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically about the two ethnic groups that I'm going to focus on. Tibet and Xinjiang are these two provinces. So Xinjiang is in the far north, and Tibet, of course, is a high mountain plateau. Tibet seems to be more well known in the West. But when I talk to people in China and talk about like minority issues, they always mention Xinjiang instead. So these are, well, they're a little bit small. So these are some pictures that I took in Xinjiang. This is 2005. So this is quite a long time ago. You see just some of what people actually look like. Uyghurs look slightly different from Han, but we've done some. One of our graduate students has done a test in his ethnic politics class and given people, Chinese students, pictures of here's a Uyghur and here's a Tibetan and here's a Han, and they can't figure out who's who, right? So unless they're wearing some of these like costumes or the cultural clothing or behaving in certain ways, it's really hard to identify. So these are some Uyghurs, and then this is what Tibetans would also look like, just to give you a little bit of a sense of kind of who we're actually talking about here. So when it comes to protest and political activity by ethnic minorities, the concerns are social stability and harmony, and separatism or splitism. So it's not, these protests and these political activities aren't just about whatever the local issue is. So it's not just about one individual corrupt leader or one instance of stealing land from the villagers. They all carry some extra weight of separatism, splitism, of broader ethnic politics. So the government is really concerned about these added risks. So even though we have these different, a lot of diversity within these various different ethnic groups, the interpretation by the government tends to be that protest by an individual who happens to be Tibetan is a Tibetan issue and is going to spread to other members of the same ethnic group. So the issue could be very narrow, could be non-ethnic if it were in a different place or by a different person, but it has an added weight and added concern for the state. So protests might still get you some information about what people are thinking and how policy is being implemented, but it could also come with very big risks and very big costs. So we think that probably they're going to not want to pay those potential costs. So in order to test this, this is with Wenfeng Tang in our department. We have a new survey we have 8,000 individuals. And one of the questions, we have 15,000 minorities out of that 8,000 individuals. So we oversampled ethnic minorities so we could try to get a good sense of what Uyghurs and Tibetans are actually thinking. And so the question that we're asking for this particular project is, if you are unfairly treated by the government, which choice of action are you most likely to take? So the first one, ask the relevant government department. So this is something that is relatively private. It's easy for the government to control how they respond and to respond quickly and privately and appropriately to that person. The second one is protest or petition. This is much more confrontational, obviously, much more public. Other people within potentially that ethnic group or within that aggrieved group are going to know that this is going on, and maybe they'll actually also join. The third one is use the courts or the media or the internet. These are all controlled by the state. The courts are not independent. And the media, of course, is heavily censored, and so is the internet. So these are relatively more public, right? But they're also still institutionalized and moderated by the state. Finally, we have family and friends, so if you have some kind of problem, the first person I would talk to, of course, is Bill. So those kinds of things are hard for the government, hard for the state to control, to know about even, and to moderate it or respond. And then finally, of course, you could do nothing. You might have a problem and you might just stay home and say, it's not a big deal, I'm fine, it's fine. So we want to compare what these different ethnic groups would prefer. I can see that these results are a little bit, I was going to try to change this slide so that these were a little bit easier to see. But I'll walk you through it. So on the left-hand side, we have the preferences for Han groups. And the color that I really want you to pay attention to here is the ask government, is this dark maroon. So Han, the higher up they are, the more likely they are to prefer that political action. So about 1 in 3 Han is likely to say, if I have some kind of problem, I'll ask the government. Now, the center column is Uyghur. And again, looking at that dark maroon color, the ask the government, you'll see that it's way up there at 0.8. So that means 4 out of 5 Uyghurs are going to take their first choice of action is to go to the government, go directly to the government if they have some kind of problem. And then the far right one is the Tibetans, which is also relatively high. You can see it's still that highest dot there. So we still have more than half of them say, if we have some kind of problem, we will go to the government. Now, there's a couple of other things that I also want to point out here. Confrontation is the blue X there. So more than 1 in 10 Han say, if I have a problem, I will do some kind of confrontation. I will either protest or petition in some kind of way. I don't have a problem confronting the government directly. In contrast, you can't really see the Uyghur or Tibetan because we have almost nobody who says that they will take any kind of confrontational action at all. In our entire sample, we had 1 Tibetan who said, yeah, I would confront the government, no problem, right? That's also similar levels to take no action, though. What's really interesting to me here is that Tibetans and Uyghurs, this is the empty blue circle, are very unlikely to stay home. If they have a problem, they will do something about it, most likely go to the government. Whereas Han, so 1 in 5, Han says, oh, if I have a problem, I don't have it, I'll stay home. It's no big deal, right? So we see that there are these differences between ethnic groups. So just to clarify what I've just said, asking the government is most likely among Uyghurs and then Tibetans, and much more likely than among the Han. Confrontation is far and away most likely among Han. And then in terms of do nothing, the Han are most likely to also do nothing. So what does this actually tell us about these different groups and these different preferences that we have? So among Han, we see that there's actually like a variety of preferences, that some people will do some things and others will do other things. But they overall prefer these relatively institutionalized channels, So going to the government, going to the courts, using the internet, something like that. That's the most popular overall, but we still do see that there are the other options. They are willing to take these other options. Generally, public channels are fine. And we've seen this in other research, that one of the ways, if you want to get the government to respond to something, is to threaten that you may take it public, or threaten that you may instigate public action of some kind. That even if you're going through a private channel, just an email to a government official, if you threaten to make it public, you get a better response. And then in contrast, we have Uyghurs and Tibetans that always prefer these institutionalized channels and prefer private channels. Particularly the Uyghurs really prefer these private channels that are not going to be made public and that are not really that as risky for the government overall. And then they rarely will do nothing. So one of the things that I want to point out here is, of course, that we're using survey data in China. And one of the problems that we have, and that the Chinese government has with getting information, is that people will sometimes lie and sometimes tell you what you want to hear, right? So I know somebody was going to ask me about whether or not you actually believe these data. So, well, I do believe the data, but even if they're all lying, this is telling us something really interesting about the incentives of the state, right? So what they're telling us is what the politically and socially appropriate response is. If you have a problem, and you are Uyghur or you're Tibetan, don't stay home. If you have a problem, go talk to the government. Do something privately and address it. Don't let it fester. The government needs information about what's going on in these places and what's going on with these different ethnic groups. In contrast, the Han can have a little more flexibility about what the most appropriate response is. So, am I on time? Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay. All right. So when we're applying this to, I referenced at the very beginning these protests in Tibet and Xinjiang, most recently in 2008 and 2009. And these really kind of illustrate the concerns that I've talked about. They started off with relatively small, relatively narrow protests. The one in Tibet started off, there was a monk who was arrested and hadn't been released after 10 days, and so some of his friends went and protested. This spiraled out of control and ends up with protests across the Tibetan plateau and in Tibetan areas outside of the Tibetan Autonomous Region. So this is one of the things that the government really doesn't want to see, is one spark, one person detained, and then a protest about it then spreads out of control, and we see people detained. We see people, more than 100 people lighting themselves on fire over what is interpreted as these ethnic issues. This is really about interpretation of what these different risks are, and anything that is public and has the potential to get out of hand is really interpreted as an existential crisis when it has to do with ethnic minorities, particularly these ethnic minorities that have some separatist groups either operating inside the country or outside of the country. And then the last thing I'll note on this is that the local governments really don't want to have to deal with this at all, right? So local officials are promoted based on how well they do at their jobs. And one of the things that's really important is social stability. And so if those officials, if they have some kind of unrest take place on their watch, that looks really bad for them. That means that they're not performing on social stability, right? And so they have an incentive to shut things down, to repress any kind of action, to make sure that there's no public activity that could look like they're not actually doing a good job. So I think that's part of why we see such heavy repression, is part of this local incentive to repress, but also the kind of the bigger picture of this existential crisis, even if it seems like it's just something relatively small. So the other piece of this, of course, is that we think that people are rational, so we think that people know that there will be this kind of repression, right? And yet people are still going out and protesting, still lighting themselves on fire. I think this is telling us really about the strength of these grievances, that they're willing to forego these costs and take this political action anyway. So I'll just conclude with wrapping up with that, that these are really extreme grievances if we do see this kind of protest, because we know that there's going to be a response. We know that there's going to be some kind of repression. But that the context in which these different actions, it could be the same action taking place in two different parts of China, the context really matters for how the response and really how we should interpret those issues. And then, of course, that information is still a problem for both the government and for us. Are these widespread grievances? We don't know. The Chinese government doesn't know. Nobody really knows. So information is a problem. But the government is really trying to work for harmony and stability. And I'll leave it up for you to decide whether you think that is actually the direction of that this is going. So with that, I would love to take your questions.
So the first question is about the definition of ethnic groups. Do some members of a given ethnic group, let's say Miao, for example, actually identify themselves as Han, even if they grew up in a Miao community and speak Miao, but they also learned Mandarin and live in the modern Han part of China?
Possibly. You can't be of mixed heritage. You have to pick one ethnic group. So typically you're given an ethnic group at birth, and then I think it's when you turn 18, I think you have a window of 2 years when you can actually change what your identity is based on ancestry. So we have actually seen more people self-identifying as ethnic minorities than we would have thought just based on birth rates. So we think that there's not really a stigma about being a minority in any way. In fact, you actually get some added benefits, including points on your college entrance exam and things like that, depending on the ethnic group. So, I mean, I suppose it's possible that you could identify as a different group. And there's one group in Guizhou, actually, I can't remember which group it is. I think it might be Golao, that they think they're Han. That's the general consensus among the whole group. So it's possible, but at this point, the 56 divisions are fairly basically taken for granted.
In the minority regions, what is the language used in schools? Is it Mandarin or is it the local dialect or language?
So everyone does need to learn Mandarin, but you are allowed to have bilingual education. What that means varies by area, right? So it's implemented locally. So in some cases, that means that that Mandarin education starts at year 5. Some places it starts at year 1. There's a lot of variation. Some of the protests most recently in Tibetan areas have been about changing that they didn't want to change to have Mandarin be the primary language of instruction and then only have Tibetan and English taught as individual classes. So it's a contentious issue, but you are supposed to have bilingual education.
What level of the government decides whether a protest is acceptable?
I don't know. I've never had the chance to actually ask that, so that would be an interesting research project.
Can you tell us about how the Chinese press or media more generally report the mass incidents you mentioned, or do they report them at all?
So some of them they do not report, media is not necessarily my area of Chinese study, but I know that there are certainly some restrictions on reporting mass incidents, particularly if there's any kind of violence that's involved. So I do know in Xinjiang, there was more severe restrictions on reporting or even spreading rumors on like blogs and things like that about reporting or spreading rumors or spreading fake news about any kind of protest that was going on, and this was you were going to be severely punished for it. So there's definitely restrictions on it.
So judging by the questions, you headed off any challenges to your survey methodology. But there is this interesting question on the other side of the equation, which is, have you had the opportunity to do qualitative interviews with people? How do you think qualitative interviewing would alter your work or results?
So let's see. My work is mostly in Guizhou. So the part of the reason that I wanted to go there in particular is that there's a lot of diversity. About 30% of the population is from various minority groups. But they're not generally considered sensitive minority groups. And so I think that I could do some more interviews with groups there. I think... Yeah, what's the second part of the question? What am I forgetting?
Just would qualitative results produce anything different? Would qualitative data produce anything different?
Yeah, I think so. Part of what's missing from this question is something about what are the actual grievances and how strong are the grievances and who do you actually blame for these things. So we would probably get a better sense of what are political issues or what are ethnic politics issues for these different groups, which we don't really necessarily have a sense of right now.
So you don't have any open-ended questions like what really drives you crazy about our government? No. So I have a series of questions here, 3 cards, about your own research conditions in China, being from the United States. So I'll just kind of read them, but they're covering similar ground. What limitations do you operate under when you're doing your research in China? And given the sensitivity about ethnic politics, have you felt a need to self-censor your research? Then, just as a rhetorical question, could you get a visa if you had a free Tibet bumper sticker? Here in Iowa City, maybe? I don't know. You wouldn't enter that on the visa application form, probably. And have you sensed any change in the openness of the Chinese state to foreigners being involved in research on potentially sensitive issues, particularly in the last 5 years?
Okay, so my own restrictions, it varies dramatically. So I'll give you an example. I went and I was doing some research on in an area where they have a new UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so they were really excited about having me there. They're really excited about having tourists. And I felt like there were no restrictions at all until they were going to have a ceremony and have officials from the provincial government and maybe even some national officials come and come into town and see what was going on. And so as soon as I showed up, I took another research trip. I didn't know this was happening. It was like 3 or 4 days before the ceremony was going to take place. And all of a sudden, we had to actually follow all of the rules associated with foreigners doing research, registering at hotels, having somebody with me all the time, all of those kinds of things. So there are rules, and sometimes they are implemented. It just kind of depends on the political, the timing and the location, and whether or not you have. It was always very important for me to have a letter from a local university that said, we know who she is and we know she's doing okay work, and we will kind of take responsibility if she does something terrible. One of the people who I'm working with now still remembers that I was in a village that I didn't have cell phone reception, so I didn't actually know any of this was going on. But he got a call from one of the local officials who said, what is she doing, and can you get her out of here? We don't want her here. And so he had to kind of talk this official down from the ledge and be like, she's fine, it's okay, she's allowed to be here, it's not a big deal. He likes to tell that story. He's very proud of that. So in terms of increased restrictions in the last few years, I've heard it more from colleagues who are more nervous about it than more nervous about doing politically sensitive research. And the scope of what is politically sensitive has kind of expanded a little bit in the last 5 years. Any further back than that, I've heard that in the 90s, you could go and do research on whatever you wanted, and it was no problem. And then people started publishing things that were not flattering. And so local government officials were like, well, don't come here and publish something unflattering. Go to our neighbor and publish something unflattering about them instead. They're not always super happy to have me there, but really, generally, I haven't felt like there's been any restrictions at all. And people are very open and very, once they know what you're doing and know who you are, they're very welcoming.
All right, we have time for one more question. And this question noted that the current U.S. ambassador to China is former Governor Terry Branstad of Iowa. They didn't take it anywhere particularly bad or anything. But the question was just in general whether your research, or in particular this issue, whether you'd have any advice for the U.S. ambassador in dealing with the Chinese.
No. Yeah, no. I mean.
Should he go to Xinjiang?
Should he go to Xinjiang? Yes. I think everybody should travel as many places in China as they possibly can, because there's so much variation. I'm also a rural, I don't really like cities at all. And so I try to get out of the cities as quickly as possible. So I would also recommend that he do that. How about that?
Yeah. All right. So we now conclude our program. We're going to give a big thank you to Elise Pizzi for her presentation. Yes. Let me again thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa International Programs, the Honors Program, the Public Policy Center, and the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization. We're very grateful to all of them. We also thank today's special sponsors, Bill and Pat Supel and Mike Carberry. And again, thanks to City Channel 4 for making our programs available to our viewing audiences. Now, Elise, as a small token of our appreciation, I am very pleased to be able to present you with the coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug.
I've been waiting 2 years for this.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We're adjourned.